This medieval insulation secret kept castles warm. Costs almost nothing. Picture this. It's January 1347. You're standing in the Great Hall of Bodiam Castle in Sussex, England. Outside, the temperature has dropped to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice clings to the moat, wind howls across the open fields. But inside, you're warm enough that you've loosened your woolen tunic. Now here's the kicker. The castle has no furnace, no central heating, no fiberglass batting in the walls. The fireplaces are massive, sure, but they're also incredibly inefficient by modern standards. Most of the heat goes straight up the chimney. The stone walls are 3 feet thick, but stone is actually a terrible insulator. It has an R value of about 0.08 per inch. Your average modern wall with fiberglass insulation? R13 to R19? So how were medieval people staying warm in buildings that should, by all modern logic, be freezing death traps? They knew something we forgot. And it cost them almost nothing. The fabric solution. Let's start with the most visible trick, the one that's hiding in plain sight in every medieval illustration and painting you've ever seen. Tapestries. I know what you're thinking. Fancy wall decorations for rich people? Status symbols. Medieval Instagram posts? Wrong. Those weren't decorations. They were insulation. And they worked absurdly well. A thick wool tapestry creates a dead air space between the cold stone wall and the room. Dead air is one of nature's best insulators. That's literally how modern insulation works, by trapping air in tiny pockets. A heavy tapestry hanging even 6 inches from the wall creates an insulating air gap that can reduce heat loss by 30 to 40% on that wall. We know this because researchers at the University of Edinburgh tested it in 2003 using period-accurate materials in a 14th century tower house in Scotland. The temperature difference was measurable and significant. But here's what most people miss. You didn't need expensive tapestries to make this work. Poor households used cheap wool blankets, old clothing sewn together, even animal hides. Anything that created that air gap and added a layer of textile insulation. Your grandmother probably knew this trick if she grew up before central heating became standard. Hanging blankets or quilts on exterior walls during winter. That wasn't poverty. That was physics. And medieval people took it further. They didn't just cover one wall. They covered everything. Bedchambers had fabric walls. Literally, fabric stretched on frames creating mini rooms within rooms. You've seen those canopy beds in medieval paintings? Those weren't just for privacy. Those heavy curtains created a microclimate around the bed. Pull those curtains closed, and you're in your own insulated pod. The air you breathe warms the small space, and the fabric traps it. People regularly slept comfortably in rooms where you could see your breath when you woke up. Before you opened those curtains, the cost? Wool was everywhere. Every household had access to wool scraps, old clothing, worn-out blankets. If you were weaving your own fabric anyway, which most households were, making insulating wall coverings was just part of the winter prep, like canning vegetables or stacking firewood. The stuff in the walls. Now let's talk about what you couldn't see. The insulation inside the walls. Most medieval buildings weren't solid stone. Stone was expensive and difficult to work with. The majority of structures, even many castle interiors, used wattle and daub construction. You take thin wooden strips woven together like a basket, then plaster both sides with a mixture of clay, sand, straw, and animal dung. Sounds primitive, right? That mixture has an R value of about 0.4 to 0.8 per inch. Not amazing by modern standards, but respectable. And here's the brilliant part. They added animal hair, horse hair, cow hair, sheep's wool scraps, goat hair, anything they had. Hair is an excellent insulator because each strand traps air along its length. It also creates structural reinforcement in the plaster, preventing cracks. A 6-inch thick wattle and daub wall with generous amounts of animal hair could hit R values around 4 to 5. Your modern vinyl-sided house with no insulation? About R4. Nobody was throwing away animal hair. When you slaughtered a pig, you saved the bristles. When you sheared sheep, you kept the short fibers that couldn't be spun into yarn. When you groomed your horse, you collected the hair. It all went into the walls. Cost? Literally zero. These were waste products. And then there's the roof insulation that everybody completely misunderstands. The thatch mystery. Modern people think thatch roofs were a sign of poverty, something you used if you couldn't afford proper tiles or slate. The medieval reality was different. Thatch was chosen by people who could afford alternatives because it was actually superior in one critical way: insulation. A properly laid thatch roof is 12 to 16 inches thick. It's not just straw or reeds lying there. It's densely packed layers compressed and angled to shed water while trapping massive amounts of air. The R value of a good thatch roof is somewhere between R30 and R40. That's better than most modern attic insulation. Compare that to slate or clay tiles, which were more expensive and gave you an R value of basically nothing. Sure, they lasted longer and didn't need replacement as often, but if keeping warm was your priority, thatch won. The University of Plymouth did thermal imaging studies on historical thatched buildings in Devon in 2011. Buildings with original thatch roofs showed 60% less heat loss through the roof compared to similar buildings that had been upgraded to slate in the Victorian era. Let that sink in for a second. The expensive modern improvement made the buildings colder. And here's the thing about thatch: the material was free. If you lived anywhere near wetlands, you had access to reeds. If you farmed grain, you had straw. The labor was the only cost, and in a pre-industrial society, labor was something you had plenty of. The airlock strategy. But medieval builders didn't stop at materials. They understood something about architecture that we've partially forgotten: thermal zones. Your modern house tries to heat the entire interior to the same temperature. That's actually insane from an energy perspective. You're pumping heat into your garage, your hallways, your closets, spaces you barely use. Medieval buildings were designed in layers, like an onion. The outermost rooms were cold. Storage areas, workshops, dairies, where the cold was actually useful. These spaces acted as buffer zones, insulating the inner rooms from the outside temperature. Then you had common areas, halls, kitchens, moderately heated, used during the day. The innermost rooms, sleeping chambers, solar rooms, these could be kept genuinely warm because they were surrounded by other spaces that took the brunt of the cold. And the transitions between zones? Small doors, low doorways, thick curtains. Every opening was a potential heat leak, so they minimized them. When you did have to have a doorway, you made it small and added a heavy curtain or second door to create an airlock. The principle is identical to modern commercial buildings with double-door entrances, but medieval builders were doing it 700 years ago using wool curtains and lumber. Walk through a medieval manor house, and you'll notice you're constantly ducking through doorways and pushing aside fabric barriers. That's not because medieval people were short, though they were somewhat shorter on average. It's because they were obsessively preventing heat loss. Modern open-concept floor plans are thermal nightmares by comparison. You're trying to heat one massive volume of air with no zones, no barriers, and maximum surface area exposed to exterior walls. The window solution. Now let's address the obvious problem. Medieval buildings had windows. Windows are terrible for insulation. So what did they do? First, they made windows small. Really small. A 12th century castle window might be 18 inches wide and 3 feet tall. That's it. Just enough to let in light and see out. Your modern living room window? Probably 6 feet wide. You've got 8 times the surface area losing heat. But they still needed light during the day, so they couldn't eliminate windows entirely. Enter the window covering system. During the day, windows had internal shutters, solid wooden panels that fit snugly into the window opening. At night or during storms, you closed them. The shutter itself provided some insulation, but the real trick was what they did to it. They stuffed the gap between the shutter and the window opening with fabric, straw, or moss, creating once again that dead air space that does the actual insulating. Wealthier households eventually got glass windows, but here's what's wild. Early glass was so expensive that it was considered furniture, not part of the building. When you moved, you took your glass windows with you. They were framed in lead or wood in sections small enough to transport. And even with glass, they still used shutters at night for insulation. The poorest households used oiled linen or scraped animal horn in the window openings, both translucent enough to let light through, both providing more insulation than an open hole in the wall. And when winter hit hard, they'd stuff the entire window opening with straw wrapped in cloth, sacrificing light for warmth. Nobody was trying to maintain a view during a blizzard. That's modern thinking. The heat storage trick. Here's where medieval builders got genuinely clever in a way that modern construction has mostly abandoned. Thermal mass. Those thick stone walls and floors weren't just structural, they were batteries for heat. Stone absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. During the day, the fire heats the room, and the walls absorb that warmth. At night, when the fire dies down, the walls radiate heat back into the room for hours. A thick stone floor near a fireplace could stay warm to the touch 8 hours after the fire went out. This is basic thermodynamics, but we've engineered it out of modern buildings. Your house has thin drywall over wood studs with insulation in between. That insulation stops heat transfer, which is good, but it also means your walls store zero heat. When your furnace shuts off, the temperature starts dropping immediately. You're dependent on continuous heating. Medieval buildings could go all night without a fire and still maintain survivable temperatures because the stone was slowly giving back the day's accumulated heat. And they maximized this effect with strategic placement. Kitchens were almost always on the ground floor, centrally located. The constant cooking fires heated the kitchen, and that heat radiated into adjacent rooms. The floor above the kitchen, usually the great hall or main living area, benefited from rising warmth. Chimneys weren't exterior walls. They ran through the center of the building, and the warm chimney mass radiated heat to multiple rooms. Modern energy codes actually discourage this. We're told to put chimneys and ductwork on exterior walls and in attics, where they lose the most heat. It's efficient for the HVAC system, but it wastes the thermal mass benefit entirely, the forgotten floor covering. Let's talk about something nobody mentions when they picture medieval castles: floor covering. Your mental image probably involves cold stone floors, maybe some straw scattered around for the dogs. That's partially from Victorian-era illustrations that got it wrong, and partially from Hollywood. The reality was layers. First, you had straw or rushes on the stone floor, 6 to 12 inches thick, replaced regularly. That layer alone provided insulation from the cold stone below and created a softer walking surface. Then, in living areas, you added woven rush mats. These were cheap, made from the same wetland plants used for thatching. The mats trapped air underneath and provided another insulation layer. In wealthy households, you'd add wool rugs on top of that. But even poor households had the straw and rush mat combination. The insulation value was significant. Researchers testing period flooring combinations at the Weald and Downland Living Museum in England found that proper rush floor covering reduced heat loss through the floor by about 35% compared to bare stone. And here's the brilliant part about rushes and straw. They're hygroscopic. They absorb and release moisture, helping regulate humidity. Too dry in winter, the rushes release moisture. Too damp, they absorb it. You got passive humidity control along with your insulation. The cost? Rushes grew wild in wetlands. Straw was a byproduct of grain harvest. Labor and replacement time were the only expenses. We replaced all of this with hardwood and tile floors over concrete slabs. Then wonder why our feet are always cold. The forgotten science. Here's what ties all of this together. Medieval builders didn't have thermodynamics textbooks or R-value charts. They had something better. Iterative, empirical knowledge passed down over generations. If your grandfather's house was warmer than your neighbor's, you asked why. You examined the differences. You tested modifications. Over centuries, this accumulated into a body of practical building science that worked. Then we hit the Industrial Revolution and decided none of that mattered because we had coal, then oil, then natural gas, then electricity. We could brute force the heating problem. Why bother with complicated layered insulation when you can just burn more fuel? And for about 150 years, that worked fine. Fuel was cheap. Who cared about efficiency? But here's the thing. Those medieval insulation techniques still work. They don't require specialized materials or industrial manufacturing. Most of them can be implemented with agricultural waste products and basic labor. The University of Kassel in Germany has been studying low-tech building methods for developing regions since 2008. They keep coming back to medieval European techniques because they're effective, sustainable, and can be implemented with local materials anywhere. Straw clay insulation, lime plaster with animal fiber, thermal mass design, small windows with heavy coverings. These aren't historical curiosities. They're practical solutions that work in the 21st century just as well as they worked in the 14th. The modern application. So what can you actually do with this information? If you own your home, you can implement almost all of these strategies right now. Hang heavy curtains or blankets on exterior walls during winter. Create that dead air space. A $30 wool blanket from a thrift store will reduce heat loss on that wall by a measurable amount. You'll feel the difference. Add thick curtains to windows at night. Insulated cellular shades work on the same principle medieval shutters did. They trap air between layers. You can reduce window heat loss by 40% just by closing curtains at night. If you've got a room you don't use in winter, close the door and let it go cold. Use it as a buffer zone. Heat the spaces you actually occupy. Put rugs on cold floors. Multiple layers if possible. The principle hasn't changed in 700 years. If you're building or renovating, consider thermal mass. A concrete floor or brick interior wall near your heat source will store and radiate warmth. Modern radiant floor heating combined with high thermal mass is literally just the medieval system with better temperature control. And if you're really committed, lime plaster with animal fiber is making a comeback in natural building communities. You can buy lime plaster mix and add your own fiber. Horsehair is still available from farms, wool scraps from fiber artists. The R value isn't amazing, but it's breathable, non-toxic, and lasts for decades without degrading. The point isn't to live like a medieval peasant. The point is that people survived and stayed comfortable in brutal conditions using simple materials and smart design. We don't have to choose between comfort and sustainability. We just have to remember what worked before we started burning dinosaurs to heat empty hallways. Conclusion. Medieval insulation wasn't a single trick. It was a system. Multiple strategies layered together, each contributing to overall thermal performance. Fabric on walls, hair and plaster, thick thatch roofs, small windows with heavy coverings, thermal mass, strategic room layout, floor insulation from agricultural waste. None of it was expensive, all of it was effective. The reason we forgot these methods isn't because they stopped working. It's because cheap energy made efficiency irrelevant for a few generations. We optimized for construction speed and cost instead of operating performance. But energy isn't cheap anymore. It might not be cheap again in our lifetimes. The medieval builders who kept castles warm at 15 degrees Fahrenheit using fabric, straw, and animal hair weren't primitive. They were solving the same problem we face today: how to stay comfortable with limited resources, and they solved it in ways that still work. Maybe it's time we stopped looking at medieval technology as something we moved beyond and started seeing it as something we might need again. If you found these forgotten techniques valuable, hit the like button and subscribe to Medieval Over Modern for more discoveries about what we lost when we stopped looking backward. Drop a comment and let me know which insulation method surprised you most, or if you've tried any of these techniques in your own home. Share this with anyone interested in survival, natural building, or just understanding why the old ways sometimes worked better than what replaced them.